This is part 34 in the series that God may be all in all, and the subtitle is The Reconciliation of All Things. First, briefly, I wanted to follow up on the last message in which I talked about the human eye. And after the last message, Jim had commented that Charles Darwin blew up his theory of evolution by mentioning that the human eye argued against his theory. I had forgotten about that. I loathe and detest the Darwinian theory of evolution, which has deceived hundreds of millions, perhaps billions, into believing the lie that all creatures have come into existence as a result of the transformation of humans, animals, plants, and other living organisms by means of genetic mutations and natural selection. And so here's what Darwin wrote toward the end of The Origin of Species. Quote, now this is Darwin undercutting himself. Quote, to suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest possible degree. Unquote. Charles, you're blowing up your doctrine, whether you realize it or not. Despite admitting the absurdity of the eye being the result of evolution, Darwin blunders on in his self-deception, but he will be arraigned at the great white throne and will be ultimately a part of the grand chorus of humanity, proclaiming that Jesus Christ is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Philippians 2, 9 through 11. So even for Charles Darwin, who has deceived countless multitudes, there is that time when he is going to partake in praising the Father and saying that Jesus Christ is Lord. I want to devote the remainder of the message to the parable of the darnel. Many Christians, pastors, theologians, and biblical scholars contend that Jesus spoke at length about hell, a place of eternal torment, and therefore they feel compelled to preach and teach about hell. I mean, how many of you have heard, I've heard it from YouTube or from the pulpit, someone declaring, well, Jesus preached about hell more than any other person, and I believe Jesus, don't you? And so this is to address that fallacious argument. For one of the proofs of their contention, they point to Matthew 13:34, which is a part of the parable of the darnel. For example, in their commentary, Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown contend that the burning of the darnel, or the weeds, or tares, as it is variously translated, in Matthew 13:30 should be linked to Matthew 25:46, a pivotal proof text for the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. Here are the two verses in question. Matthew 13:30 ESV. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at the harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. And then Matthew 25:46 ESV. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This translation of Ionios there, that's for another time. In the mind of these commentators, and in the mind of other damnationists, these two scriptures amount to case closed, whereas nothing could be further from the truth. A person can't wrest these scriptures from their context and weigh them around and say, this is proof positive, the case closed, end of the argument. What these commentators and others have done is to wrest these scriptures from their context and made them to mean something altogether different from what Jesus was saying. Now, real estate agents often use the motto of location, location, location to speak about property accurately in its full context. A beautiful house may be located in a bad neighborhood, and therefore a person wouldn't want to buy a beautiful house in that bad neighborhood. In a similar vein, the motto of context, context, context prevents the student of Scripture from falling into the damnationist quagmire with these scriptures and other related passages. In Matthew 13, 24 through 30, Jesus teaches a parable that seems straightforward to some people on first reading, but it is easy to misinterpret this parable. Before I read the parable, I'll lay out a few hermeneutical principles for interpreting parables. These principles apply to greater or lesser degrees, and there may be exceptions to these rules. Nevertheless, these are helpful guidelines for us as we interpret the parables. First, a parable should be understood in light of its literary, historical, and cultural context. For example, we should read a parable in light of its immediate context and its broader context, and the entire book that's under consideration, in this case, the other Gospels, and then what is said elsewhere in the New Testament, the Old Testament. So there's a task at hand for those who engage with this parable. So what precedes or follows the parable in question? That's the question to answer. Second, in general, the central truth or truths are seen in the foreground of the parable. You don't have to dig deep, deep, deep. Generally, it's on the surface what Jesus is trying to get at. Although details of the background may be important, they may simply provide color to the parable. In other words, the parable serves as a vehicle for truth. On page 7 of his book, The Parables of the Kingdom, C.H. Dodd says that the emphasis on the central truth was, quote, the most important principle of interpretation, unquote. So what is the main point? What is Jesus driving at in this parable that he's teaching? That's the question. Third, subordinate or coordinate truths may support the central truth or truths of the parable. So there may be other truths that are associated with the main thing that Jesus was getting at, but they serve to amplify and buttress the central truth. Fourth, a parable is a figurative narrative that flows toward a dramatic conclusion with the features in the narrative contributing toward a dramatic conclusion. We have to remember these are small fictional stories that Jesus has developed, based on his observation in life and his pondering on scriptures. And so they're a narrative, a little narrative that flows to a conclusion. After the comparison is made, the parable is finished. Let's consider the overall focus of Jesus' ministry as seen in Matthew. So I'm going to try to provide the broader context for understanding what Jesus was getting at and what his ministry was that sometimes gets lost in the conversation. Although at times Jesus ministered to and on behalf of Gentiles, his primary calling was for Israel. And we read this in Matthew 15, 21 through 28. And so here's an excellent example where Jesus is ministering to a Gentile, but it's within the broader scope of his ministry to Israel. So quickly, Matthew 21 through 28 ESV. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." Now, literally, this is into the districts of Tyre and Sidon. The text does not mean that Jesus actually crossed from Palestine into these districts, because the Canaanite woman came from the region of Tyre and Sidon to meet Jesus. In other words, she's coming from her district, Tyre and Sidon, to meet Jesus. Thus, Jesus was in the Galilean districts that bordered Tyre and Sidon. Picking up from verse 23, and he did not answer her a word, and his disciples came and begged him, saying, send her away, for she is crying out after us. I mean, she must have been at the top of her lungs, desiring the Lord to do this for her. He answered, now this may sound harsh, but remember that Jesus was sent as the anointed one, the Messiah, for Israel first. He, meaning Jesus, answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Oh, Jesus, you're being too rough on this poor Canaanite woman. But she came out and knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. And he answered, it is not right to take the children's bread and to throw it to dogs. I mean, these are some of the tough sayings of Jesus. He's basically saying, you Gentiles are dogs. And I mean, you don't have a part of the covenant with Yahweh, and so you're outside the covenant. She said, yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Then Jesus said to her, O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire. And her daughter was healed instantly. I mean, there's the heart of Jesus. You know that he wanted to extend this mercy of deliverance to the poor afflicted daughter. So that's the context of, he's dealing primarily with Israel and what's going on during his ministry and what's going to happen subsequent to his ministry. In terms of the literary and historical context, the parable of the darnel appears after Jesus has encountered fierce opposition, which is noted in Matthew 9, 3, 11, 14, 34, 10, 25, and 11, 19. In other words, this opposition and hatred is building toward Jesus. And so you can see there's a divide within Israel. The Pharisees and Sadducees and Herodians and others having a murderous intent toward Jesus, and then a lot of the people, common people, gladly following him. Matthew 12, 13 through 14, Jesus begins to encounter murderous opposition after he healed a man with a withered hand. We read of this in the ESV. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. So you see, there's just, you're with Jesus or you're against him in this matter. Thus, the parable of the darnel must be seen in light of Jesus' concern to show the division that is occurring and will yet occur as a result of the preaching of the word. Furthermore, as Matthew 13, 34 through 36 shows, Jesus was speaking to the crowd, not just the disciples, and that means that the crowd was undoubtedly a mixture of those who believed him and those who opposed him. Now, going to the text of the parable, we read from the Concordant Literal New Testament, Matthew 13, 24 through 30. Another parable he places before them, saying, likened was the kingdom of the heavens to a man sowing ideal seed in his own field. Yet while the men are drowsing, his enemy came and sowed his darnel amidst the grain and came away. Now when the blade germinates and produces fruit, then appeared also the darnel. Now approaching, the slaves of the householder said to him, Lord, do you not sow ideal seed in your field? Whence then has it darnel? Then he averred to them, a man, an enemy, does this. Now the slaves are saying to him, do you then want us to come away that we should be culling them? Yet he is averring, by no means, lest at some time, while culling the darnel, you should be rooting up the grain at the same time with it. Leave both to grow up together until the harvest. And in the season of the harvest, I shall be declaring to the reapers, call first the darnel and bind them into bundles to burn them up, yet the grain gather into my barn. The man sowing the good seed is first, Jesus in his ministry, and then, as I understand, all others who have preached the gospel subsequent to him. Now, it helps us to know what darnel is. It isn't a commonly used word, but it's in the commentaries and it's in concordant literal translation. Darnel grows up at first with stalk and blade like the wheat, and it's hard to distinguish darnel from wheat. The difference is not easily detected until fructification, when darnel appears black and the wheat appears golden. So, boom. And there they are. You can see the difference. The seeds of the darnel are not only useless as food, but also noxious. Does the parable of the darnel reflect what has happened in history? I think the answer to that is yes. As Lang points out concerning the parable, quote, accordingly, we cannot fail to trace in the parable of the sower a picture of the apostolic age. In the parable of the tares, the ancient Catholic Church, springing up in the parable of the tares, the ancient Catholic Church springing up in the midst of heresies. In the parable of the mustard bush, resorted to by many birds of the air as if they were a tree and loaded with their nests, a representation of the secular state church under Constantine the Great, unquote. And so that's happened. In Jesus' day, there was darnel, and boy, do we have darnel. It seems like there's a precious little golden wheat. What is this harvest when the reapers gather weeds to be burned and gather wheat into Jesus' barn? Now, the damnationists would say, well, of course, it's the lake of fire. What further proof need we for this interpretation? Is it the final judgment at the great white throne? Well, no. The conclusion of the harvest is not the judgment at the great white throne, because that judgment concerns all humanity after the end of the millennium, so after the kingdom age, which Jesus was preparing people for. It's all about people entering into the kingdom and who would be worthy to enter into the kingdom. Jesus spoke of the millennium, that is, of the kingdom, the time of God's kingdom on earth, but not about its conclusion. In other words, he was concerned about what was going to transpire until his second coming, and the work and the signs that would be occurring, and signs of the end, and then the coming of the Son of Man, Son of Mankind, and all the tribulation that would accompany it, and then the kingdom age. Jesus interprets the parable of the darnel, and so we are not left guessing. In Matthew, Jesus defines the conclusion of the eon, saying that it concludes with the second coming, the presence of the Son of Man to establish the kingdom on earth. Thus, Jesus says of the parable of the darnel in Matthew 13:36 through 43 in the concordant literal, then, leaving the throngs, he entered into the house, and his disciples come to him, saying, elucidate to us the parable of the darnel of the fields. They're puzzled over this. What is this? Is it not just the darnel, but is the wheat, but the focus in their mind was the darnel. Now he, answering, said, he who is sowing the ideal seed is the Son of Mankind. In other words, Jesus himself, primarily. Now the field is the world. Now the ideal seed, these are the sons of the kingdom. Now the darnel are the sons of the wicked one. In other words, it's talking about Satan, the adversary. Now the enemy who sows them is the adversary. Now the harvest is the conclusion of the eon. Now the reapers are messengers. In other words, we're talking about angels here. Even as the darnel then are being culled and burned up with fire, thus shall it be in the conclusion of the eon. The Son of Mankind, shall be dispatching his messengers, and they shall be culling out of his kingdom all the snares and those doing lawlessness. And they shall be casting them into a furnace of fire. There shall be lamentation and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the just be shining out as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who has ears to hear, let him hear. In his Olivet Discourse, Jesus speaks of the conclusion of the eon occurring at his second coming. Matthew 24, 1 through 3, concordant literal. And coming out, Jesus went from the sanctuary, and his disciples approached to exhibit to him the buildings of the sanctuary. In other words, isn't this impressive? They were wowed by the gold on the gleaming on the temple of Herod. And coming out, yet he answering said to them, are you not observing these things? Verily I am saying to you, under no circumstances may a stone here be left upon a stone which shall not be demolished. And of course that happened in AD 70 when the Romans under Titus came and demolished the temple and didn't leave a stone on top of the stone. Now, as sitting on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately, tell us, when will these things be? In other words, these things concerning the temple. And what is the sign of thy presence and of the conclusion of the eon? And the presence meaning what we commonly call the second coming. So the disciples asked 3 questions. The latter 2 questions have relevance for the parable of the darnel. The Greek word for presence is parousia, which Jesus uses exclusively in Matthew to refer to the second coming. Thus we read in Matthew 24, 29 through 31 in the concordant literal. Now immediately after the affliction of those days, so it's talking about the tribulation period here, shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not be giving her beams, and the stars shall be falling from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. We read of things of that nature in the book of Revelation. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Mankind in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the land shall grieve, and they shall see the Son of Mankind coming on the clouds of heaven with power and much glory. And he shall be dispatching his messengers, that is his angels, with a loud sounding trumpet, and they shall be assembling his chosen from the 4 winds, from the extremities of the heavens to their extremities. So the messengers are angels, which are referred to as reapers in the parable. This view of the judgment as occurring at the second coming and thereafter comports with the role of the disciples that they were to occupy after their raised from the dead. Matthew 19, 27 through 28, concordant literal. And answering, Peter said to them, Lo, we leave all and follow thee. What consequently will it be to us? Yet Jesus said to them, Verily I am saying to you that you who follow me in the Renaissance, whenever the Son of Mankind shall be seated on the throne of his glory, you also shall sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus will sit on the throne of his glory when he begins his reign during the millennium. So in conclusion, the central truth of the parable of the darnel is a separation of 2 groups. You have those for Jesus, those against him. It's a separation of 2 groups at the conclusion of the eon, which occurs at the parousia, of the second coming, of the Son of Mankind, namely at the second coming. This parable has nothing to do with the lake of fire, which would not be revealed in its totality until the glorified Christ visited John on the island of Patmos. Thus, another proof text for eternal hell goes up in smoke.